Today we're going to add the possibility for the player to trigger combats in the overworld. So by controlling his unit teams, he'll be able to move towards the target and attack an enemy group. And once the unit reaches the group, the combat is going to start and the player will be able to play the combat. Obviously, once the combat is over, he'll be teleported back in the overworld to move around and start another combat if he wants to. So let's get to it. So in Unreal, the first thing I'm gonna do is not actually related to today's video, it's just that I'd like to change a little something. Right here in my combat utilities, we have a structure that contains a unit set, but in my case, I think I'd like to switch it to an array instead of a set. It's just that I don't really like working with a set anymore, so I'm just going to switch it back to an array. You don't have to do it if you don't want to. It's not going to affect anything or barely something, so you don't have to do it if you don't want to, and a set is actually more performant than an array, so if you want to keep the performance, you can keep the set. But in my case, I rather the array, so I'm just going to switch it back to an array. So instead of unit set, I'm going to rename my structure unit array, and then I'm going to open it to rename the variable that is inside, so unit array, and I'm going to change it from a set to an array. Here we go. Now we can save and close the structure. We can do a save all, and it's probably going to cause some issues. So let's press play right here, and Unreal tells us that these three actors are not compiling anymore. So I'm just going to open all three blueprints. Here we go. Close this warning, and then we have to go in the graph to fix the issues. This one is super simple. It's just to remove the to array right here because we don't need it anymore since the array is already an array. Just like that, delete the to array. Then I can compile and it works. So tab combat is now fixed. Now in the combat system, I have a few errors. So I'm going to go here. Okay, it seems to fail to set the set because it's not a set anymore. It's an array. So I'm just going to convert my local variable to an array. Change variable type, yes. I'm going to rename it the unit array also, and I'm going to reconnect my variable just like that. For the remove, we have to replace it with the remove on the array instead of the remove on the set, just like that right here. And same thing for the length right here. I'm just going to use the length on the array instead of the set. Here we go, if I can connect it. There we go. Okay, now at the bottom right here, same thing. I'm going to reconnect my variable, do an add on the array instead of on the set, just like that. And here we go. Perfect. Add the unit inside it. And then just reconnect my map right here, just like that. Here we go. That's done. Now we can compile. We have still some issues to fix. Okay, we still have one at the end. So I'm just going to reconnect it and then we can recompile again. Okay. Now I have a bunch of other errors. It's just because that the name was not updated. So I can just select everything and do a refresh node. It's going to rename the node for us. Here we go. Now it seems to work in that function. There's still one error left. So I'm going to click on it. And here it is. I just have a to array to remove. So I can just remove it like so. Here we go. Now the BP combat system should be fixed. Yes. Okay, good. I can close it. Now in the unit AI, let's go see what's happening. Same thing. I have a to array right here that I can simply remove just like that. Compile again. I have another one right here. So same thing to array. I can just remove it like that. Here we go. So now if I compile, yes, everything is compiling properly. And now if I go in the game, I'm just going to try to add a few units in combat and see if I can start a combat properly the same as before, making sure that everything still works. So I can move around, I can select all my units and stuff, and it seems to work properly. I can end my combat. Yeah, okay, everything seemed to work, so that's good. We didn't break anything. We simply switched the set back to an array. Okay, now, so to be able to trigger the combat from the overworld, I think it would be a good idea to add some kind of identifier in the combat system to know which object in the game started the combat, because it's possible that you have some kind of different logic in the case that, let's say, you started the combat from the debug menu like we are doing right now, or in the case that the combat was triggered from an overworld encounter, maybe there's some extra logic you would like to do in that case, or maybe what if the combat was triggered from a story point in your game, maybe in those cases you would like to add some other logic in your combat. So yeah, because it's possible to start the combat from anywhere in the game, I think it would be a good idea to know what is the cause of the combat, and then you can react properly if you need to. So in my case, let's say for the overworld trigger, I would like to hide all the other units that are not currently in combat, because that just doesn't make sense that they are still alive while the combat is running. So if you know which object is the cause of the combat, then you'll be able to react accordingly. So let's go do that. I'm going to go add a new variable in the combat system to remember what is the cause of the combat. So new variable right here. I named it the object that started combat, and it is of type object, a simple object, so we can feed it anything. Anything can start a combat in our game, so that's good. Now we're just going to go set that variable when we start a new combat. So in the start combat function right here, I'm going to pass an object as input, which is the object that is going to start the combat, and I'm going to use it to set my variable at the beginning of the combat. That way, if we want to know later on during the combat which object started the combat, we'll know the answer, and it is the object right here. Now, at the end of the combat, I'm just going to cancel that variable because we're not going to need it anymore. So at the end of the combat, at the end of the end combat function right here, I'm going to set the variable back to nothing. But I'm just going to check first if we are already in another combat, because it's possible. There's the callback right here that notifies the rest of the game that the combat was ended. So maybe another object just started another combat for some reason. And in those cases, we don't want to reset the variable because it's already in use. But in the case that we're still not in combat at the end of the combat, then we can just reset the variable and that's gonna be fine. And now we just have to make sure to set that variable when we are starting a new combat. So let's go see where we are using the start combat function, and actually it's inside the tab combat. So I'm gonna go in my debug menu, in my tab, and inside the tab combat right here in the graph, we are starting the combat when we are clicking on the start combat button right here. We are starting the combat. Right now we're not feeding any object, but I'm going to feed the widget as an object. This is the cause of the combat. And then if I go on the right a little bit right here, we have a callback that is reacting if the combat started or ended. And in my case, what I was doing in the debug menu is to either remember the position of the units before the combat starts or restore the unit's position after the combat ended. But we don't want to do that all the time. We just want that to happen when we are starting a combat from the debug menu. We don't want, let's say, the encounters on the grid when they are ending their combat to be restored to the same position they were before the beginning of the combat. That's not what we want to do. So what I'm going to do is add myself a little condition right here to make sure that I'm just going to execute my code in the case that the object that started the combat is myself. So if the debug menu started the combat, then we're going to do that logic right here. Perfect. So now we should be ready to start the combat from anywhere in the project without having all the actors fighting against each other. Good. But now, before we go start the combat, I'm going to refactor a little bit more. There's still another thing I'd like to change, and that's going to be in the combat system once again. There's a function right here which is called the remove unit from combat. And in this function, we have the possibility to destroy the unit actor right here. And I don't really like that. I would just like to destroy the unit actor only when I want to do it without having to go through that function. Because, well, that feature was really more useful at the beginning of the series when we were adding and removing the units from the grid, and we always wanted to destroy them when we were removing them from the grid, but now it's not really the case anymore. So I don't really want to do it in that function anymore. I'm just going to explicitly call destroy actor every time I need to destroy the actor myself. So I'm just going to delete that little bit of code right here because we don't want to destroy the actor in this function, and I'm also going to remove the boolean at the beginning of the function. Here we go. Now I'm just gonna go at the two places we are calling this function that we really want to continue destroying the actors. The first one is in the tab combat in the function restore unit after combat ended right here. And actually, yeah, in the middle of the function right here, we are removing the units from the combat if they were not in the combat before the combat started. And in that case, it makes sense to continue destroying them. So I'm just going to call the destroy actor right here on the unit. So we're still going to continue destroying the unit. That's good. And then there's one other place that I would like to continue destroying the actor, and it is inside the action. So player action, combat setup, action, add remove unit from combat, because this is really the action that adds the unit on the grid and removes the unit from the grid, and that specific action needs to continue destroying the actor. So at the end of the function, after removing the unit from the combat, I'm also going to destroy the actor. Here we go. So now that's done. We can close this action and actually close the tab combat too, because we're not gonna need it today, I think. And back in the combat system, there's one last little thing I'd like to change before we go to the next step, and it is inside the combat flow in the finish combat function right here. At the beginning of the function, we receive the winning team index, and then we feed it to the callback. That's fine. But I think it will also be useful to remember which team won the last combat, even if it happened like 5 minutes ago. So I'm just going to promote that into a new variable. So promote to new variable, I'm gonna name it team that won last combat, team index that won last combat. Here we go. And I'm also going to disconnect it from the callback. Actually, I'm just going to remove it from the callback completely because we don't need it since we have the variable for it. And the only place in the project, if I do a find reference that is using that callback, it is in the BP player action on combat finishing. So I'm gonna go right here. And if I compile, I can see that now I have an error because the signature of the callback doesn't match anymore. So I can just remove the input and that should work. But I still have an error right here at the end because we don't have access to the winning team index anymore. So I can just get it from the combat system. So get combat system, here it is, and get team index that won the last combat. Here we go. I can feed that to my function. Perfect. So now that should work as before. Perfect. Okay, let's close all those things because we don't need them. Okay, good. So now we can finally start working on the real subject of today's video, and it is to start a combat between multiple groups, unit groups in the game. So here I have a group of warrior and a group of slime, and I would like to start a combat between them. I would like to make my warrior fight the slimes. Okay, but how do we do that? We don't have a grid generated yet. The units are not placed on the grid because remember, if you want to start a combat, you have to first generate the grid. So let's say I generate a grid, then I have to go add the unit on the grid. So add the units on the grid, then I can set the teams, and then I have to decide, okay, which units are controlled by an AI, and then finally I can start the combat. But right now we don't have any of those informations. The grid is not generated and the units are clearly not in a team in a combat. They are just right there floating in the overworld. So what do we need? We need a way to start a combat by just telling the combat system, okay, please start me a combat there. These are the information for the grid. These are the information for my units. And it's your job to start the combat. So let's just do that. And that's what we're going to do, actually. We're going to add a new feature in the combat system to be able to quickly start a combat. So let's just stop right quick. And I'm going to go create myself two new structures that we're going to use to achieve that. In the combat folder, I'm going to go in my utilities folder. And here I have two new structures. I have my S quick combat underscore grid structure, which is going to contain all the data for the grid, and then I have S quick combat underscore unit teams, which is going to contain all the information for the units. Let's open both of those right here. So for the grid, we have a few variables, all the variables we need to generate a grid, but the first one is a boolean that tells us if we want to regenerate the grid or not. So do we want to regenerate the grid before starting the combat? Yes or no? If you already generated the grid somewhere else in your code and you're ready to use that grid that already exists, well, you don't want to regenerate it. That will not be useful. So that's why I added that condition right here, just in case you don't want to generate a grid. And then I have all the information you need to generate the grid. So the center location, which is a vector, the tile size, which is also a vector. Then I have a tile count, how many tiles we want in the combat, which is an endpoint, the shape of the grid, which is an e-grid shape, and finally use environment or not, which is a boolean. And in my case, I added some default variables to match my settings. So I have a grid tile size of 200 by 200 by 100, and I have a 20 by 20 grid size by default. Doesn't really matter too much because we're going to change that, obviously. Now, in the second structure, that one is going to contain all the information for our units. So first, we have the unit teams, so all the teams that are currently in combat, and that variable is an array of S unit array. So it's a list of units. That's a lot of units, yeah. But anyway, that's all the units that are going to be in combat. So if you have 10 teams, that's going to be 10 list of 10 units or less or whatever. And then you have the other variables. So you have the units controlled by an AI, which is a list of units. So all the units that are going to be controlled by an AI during the combat. And finally, I have one last variable, which is going to be the unit desired indexes. So if you already pre-calculated all the desired indexes for all your units, you can add them into that mapping, and the combat system is just going to use them if they still exist, obviously. But yeah, the combat system is going to use those indexes if you already pre-calculated them. But if you didn't, this mapping is going to be empty and it's fine. The combat system is going to place the unit semi-randomly on the grid. So yeah, this is a mapping of BP units to an endpoint, which is the index of the unit you want to assign on top of the grid. Perfect. So these are the two structures we're going to use in the new quick combat features. So let's close those two structures and go create the function in the combat system. So new function. I named it the quick start combat, and I'm feeding it all the information it needs. So first the grid data, which is the new structure we just created, S quick combat grid, and then the unit data, which is the other new structure we just created. So S quick combat unit teams, and finally we have the object that is starting the combat, the same as when we are starting a normal combat. Now we can start the combat for reals. We just have to generate the grid first. So let's do that. I'm just gonna start by checking, okay, do I need to generate the grid? Because if I don't, well, I'm I'm not going to. But if I need to generate the grid, then I can simply generate the grid. That's super simple, that's easy. That's actually the easiest part of this function by far. So here it is, we now have a grid generated for us. We now just need to add the units on top of it. So let's do that. Let's loop through all the teams that are going to be in combat. So all my unit teams that are received as input, we're going to loop through all of them and add all their units on top of the grid. But first I'm just going to save the team and the team index into new local variables because it's going to be way cleaner than connecting everything back all the way here. And now we have to add the units on the grid, but as I said, it's possible that you pre-calculated where you want to have the units on the grid or not. If you didn't, well, we need to generate a list ourselves of where we want to place the units on the grid, and that's a little bit more complicated, so I'm just going to create a new function for it. So new function right here, I named it get possible indexes for team, and I'm feeding it the team index, so the team of unit we want to add on the grid, and how many units we need to add on the grid, so quantity indexes required. And as output, I'm returning all the indexes we just calculated. We're not going to do the logic of the function right now because it's a little bit more complicated and I want to finish the other function first. So let's go back in there. So now that we have a function that gives us a list of possible indexes to place the units on the grid, let's just call it. So let's call the function right here, get possible indexes for teams, which returns us an array of indexes where we can place the units on the grid, which means that we can finally loop through all the units we have in our team, all the units that are right here, and then add them on the grid for real. So let's do that. I'm gonna go on the right a little bit and loop through all the units that are in the team, set them into a new local variable just because it's a little bit more clean as usual, and then we're going to set their index. By default, it's going to be the first index of my possible indexes list. So that way, if you didn't pre-calculate the index for your unit, it's still going to know where to go on the grid. So good. But what if you pre-calculated it? Well, you want to use that index instead, and that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to fetch in the pre-calculated index to see, okay, first, did you pre-calculate an index for your unit? Yes? Okay, good. Then we're going to also check, okay, but is that index walkable, yes or no? Because if it's not walkable, well, we're not going to put the unit there, obviously. But if it is walkable, well, okay, that's going to override the previous index we just set. So the index right here is going to be overridden by the one you pre-calculated. So good, now the unit knows where to go on the grid, and now the next step is to make sure that nobody else goes there, so we can just remove the index from the possible indexes, and then finally we can add the unit on the grid for real. So let's do that. Add the unit in combat using the index we just calculated, the team index of the unit, and then looking into the mapping to see, okay, is that unit controlled by an AI or not? And that's it. So that is going to run for all the units in the team, and that's going to run for all the teams in the combat. So we're going to loop through all the units we want to add in combat. And once that's done, once we're done looping through all of that, we can finally start the combat for real. But before we can test all that, we have to finish the other function, the get possible indexes for team. And that function is just going to generate a random list of indexes we can put the unit on. But even though it's going to be random, we still want it to make a little bit of sense. So what I'm going to do is just divide my grid in some quadrants. So let's say the first team is going to use the left side of the grid, the second team the right side, the third team maybe the upper part, and the fourth team the lower part. And that's exactly what I'm going to do right here. I'm actually dividing my grid in 9 pieces. So we have the team 0 that is using the left side, the team 1 that is using the right side, the team 2 is using the up, 3 down, etc. So now all the teams are going to be separated in different corners of the grid. And to achieve that, we just have to multiply that multiplier with the amount of tiles we have on the grid. And that's going to give us a position on the grid from which we want to start from. I say start from because we don't want all the units to be stacked on top of each other at that specific location. We want to find other tiles around that location where we can place the units, and that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to check to find all the other tiles that are around those tiles with the help of this old function we created in the past, so the get indexes from pattern and range. So around the team location index, using the green shape, whatever, we're going to draw a square pattern, a pretty big square pattern from 0 to 10 range. range, and that's going to give us all the tiles around that specific tile, and then we can loop through all those tiles and try to find which one are the best to place the units on. And in my case, since I'm lazy, I'm just going to make sure that the tiles are workable, and that should be good enough. So if the tiles are workable, I'm going to add them into a new local variable that I have right here, the valid indexes. So I'm just looking through all the tiles, making sure that they are workable and adding them into that variable. And once I have enough indexes in my valid indexes list right here, I'm just going to stop looping through all the tiles, because we don't want 10,000 tiles in the array. We just need enough for the units. And in my case, I'm actually going to use the unit count, so the quantity indexes required, and multiplying it by 3. So we have 3 more times the amount of tiles that we need to have. That way I can pick and choose which one in those tiles I want to use for reals, and I'm actually just going to pick them randomly, but that's going to give a better result than simply picking all the first ones we find. So here it is, I have 3 times more tiles that I need to, and now what I can do is simply loop through all the real amount of tiles I need to have at the end of the function, and then I can simply pick randomly a tile inside my valid indexes to set my new tile. So here I'm just setting a new random number that I'm gonna use to decide which tile I want to pick from my array, and then I'm actually just going to pick that tile and set it into a new local variable that I name ret, and that's the variable we're going to return at the end of the function. So I'm just taking that new index and adding it into a new list, which means that I can now remove it from the previous list so it doesn't get picked again. So we're making sure that we are only using the indexes once. Good, so now we have a new list, my RET list, that contains all the indexes I really want to return at the end of the function, so I can simply return them just like that. That's it, it's done. And that should be it for the new feature, the new quick start combat feature right here. So when we call this new function, it's going to generate the grid for us, place the units on the grid, and then starts the combat. So now we just have to go call that function, so let's go do that. And since we want the Overworld Group Manager to trigger that combat, well, that's where we need to call it. So let's go in the Overworld Unit Group Manager right here, and right now there's actually no reference to the combat system, so it's not going to be possible to call that function. So let's create a new variable for the combat system. New variable right here, I have my new combat system variable, and I'm actually going to create myself a new function to set it. So new function set combat system, which I'm gonna use to set my new variable combat system. Which means that now the Overworld Unit Group Manager is going to be able to call the quick combat function that we just created. But actually that's not true. We have to first set the variable, and we're going to do that inside the player action. So let's go in the player action real quick. Here it is, and I'm going to go in the begin play. At the end of the begin play, all the way at the end, I'm going to set the combat system inside my Overworld Unit Group Manager. And the reason why I have an is valid right here, it's because I know that not all of your games are going to use the overworld movement for your game, and because of that I don't want it to cause any issues. So if you have the Overworld Unit Group Manager valid in your game, it's going to set the combat system, otherwise it's just not going to, and that's good enough. Perfect. Now we want to start the combat when the unit controlled by the player reaches the unit of the enemy group we want to attack, and right now we don't have a callback for that. We don't have a callback letting us know when the unit reaches the enemy target, so I'm just going to go add that callback inside the BP unit. So new callback on unit reached unit in Overworld, and I'm feeding it a unit as input. Here it is. Now I'm gonna go in my event graph to call that callback when the unit finishes its movement. If the unit is following another unit in the Overworld, then I'm just going to I'll call my callback right here, right before the delay. So calling the callback saying that, hey, I reached my unit and now I have a delay to wait. Perfect. Now we can go back in the BP Overworld Group Manager to hook ourselves to that new callback. So same as usual, we're going to hook ourselves to that callback inside the add unit to group function right here at the end. We are hooking ourselves to all the other callbacks. We're going to do the same thing for that one. So on unit, reach unit in Overworld. I'm also going to create a matching function. Here it is, on unit, reach unit in Overworld, receiving the unit as input, obviously. And I'm also going to disconnect myself from that callback in the remove unit from current group. So at the end right here, I'm going to disconnect myself from that callback so we don't receive the notification for no reason. Now now let's go add the logic of the function inside that function actually. So when a unit reaches another unit in the overworld, we want to determine if we want to start a combat between those two units. Maybe we want, maybe we don't. So let's analyze them a little bit. So the first unit, we can find its group in the units group, and we have the first group, and we're going to do the same thing for the second group. So we have two groups of unit. Then we're going to decide, okay, do we want to make them fight together? So I'm going to go on the right here, and I'm going to add myself a little branch like that. So if the group ID of the first group is not the same as the second group, that's a good start. We don't want the same team to fight itself. That will not be good. So if the group IDs are different, that's a good start. Then my other conditions are the first group should be controlled by the player, and the second group should be an encounter. These are my three conditions. So not the same IDs. The first group is controlled by the player. The second group is controlled by the AI. And if all those conditions are true, well, we're going to start an encounter between those two groups. So the group 1 and the group 2. And to do that, I'm just going to create myself a new function just so it's a little bit cleaner. So new function trigger encounter right here. I'm feeding it the group, which is an array of S overworld unit group. So an array of group that we want to fight against each other. So now I'm going to go back in the other function at the end, and I'm going to call my new function trigger encounter. So this is where we are going to trigger the combat. So let's go back in the trigger encounter to add the logic. And actually, since I'm already thinking about how I'm going to restore the world once the combat is over, the same way we did in the debug menu when we were ending the combat and repositioning the units on the grid, I'm going to create myself a new variable to keep track of all the position of the units in the world. So here it is, I have my new variable, I named it unit positions when combat started, and it is a mapping from the unit to a vector, which is going to be the position of the units in the world. And we're going to add all the units that are currently in the world in that mapping before starting the combat. But now let's start the combat. To start the combat, I'm going to first check if we are already in combat, because if we are, well, I'm not going to start another combat. That will not make sense. And then if I'm not in combat, then I can finally start the combat. I'm going to add myself a little sequence right here because I'm going to do the code that is going to be responsible of setting all the positions of all my units first, so in the first spin, and then I'm going to start the combat for real afterwards. So to keep track of all the positions of all my units, the first step is going to be to clear that list, because if we already started a few combats before, we want to clear that list because we don't want to have trash living in there. So always clear the list, and then we can start adding units back in there. So let's root through all the units group that are currently in combat because we want to add all the units in that list. So let's root through all the units from all the units group that are in combat and add them to the list. Here we go. Now we are adding all the units that are currently living in the overworld inside that list, so that mapping. That way we're gonna know where are the units on the grid and where to place them once the combat is over. And the reason why I'm taking the position of all the units on the grid, not only the ones that are currently in combat, it's because I'm going to disable all the units that are not in combat. So here I'm checking if the group that I'm looping through is part of the combat. If it's not, well, I'm just going to disable all its units because we don't want all the units that are currently living in the world to be still alive while the combat is running. They are just going to be annoying if they are walking on the grid for no reason. So yeah, we don't want that. We want to hide all of them. So I'm going to disable all of them, and then at the end of the combat we're going to restore them back in the world. So good, now we're disabling all the units we don't need and we're keeping track of all the positions of all the units. Now we can finally start the combat for real. So I'm going to go back to my little sequence right here, and the first step is to build the grid. So to generate the grid, I'm going to create myself a new local variable right here, the grid, the data, which is going to be the new structure we created today, and it's going to contain all the information we need to generate the grid. So for the center location, I am using the position of the first unit of the first group that is currently fighting. Doesn't really matter, the grid is huge, so it doesn't really matter in the end. My tile size is the same, and for my tile count, I'm using a random for the X and the Y, just so we have a random grid size. For the tile shape, right now it's a square, but if we wanted to work with all the different grid shape, we're going to change that in a little bit. So okay, we have the grid data set, and we're ready to feed that to the combat system, but we also need to feed the units, and that's a little bit more complicated because we have the unit groups and we have to convert them into unit teams. It's not the same thing. So let's do that. I'm going to loop through all my unit groups that are part of the combat, and then I'm going to take all their units and add them into a unit team. Here it is. I have my unit team, which is a new local variable that I have right here. I'm adding all the units inside it, which is going to give me a list of the teams that we want to add in combat. And the last thing we're missing is the units that are going to be controlled by an AI. So So I'm just going to use that is encounter boolean right here to decide if I want to add the unit in the list of units that are going to be controlled by an AI, which is also a local variable that I have right here. And that's it. That's all the information we need. Now we can just call the quick start combat in the combat system right here, feeding it all the information it needs. So the grid data, that's simple. You can just feed it as is. The object that is starting the combat, well, itself, obviously. And now for the unit data, we can simply make a structure using the unit themes that we just built. And same thing for the controlled by AI. Here we go. So now that should start the combat in the game. So let's go try it because we didn't try anything in an hour. So that's not good. I'm just going to remove the grid first to make sure that the grid generation also works. I'm going to add myself a few units in the combat, actually in the world, a few slimes in the world, mark the slime as an encounter, and then move my warrior to attack the slime. Oh no, nothing's happening. That's not good. The combat is not starting. Okay, let's go see what's happening. I'm gonna go back, not in the combat system, maybe in the Overworld Group Manager. The code is not even reaching here, so that's weird. The set combat system, no. On unit reached unit in Overworld. So okay, the code is reaching here. We're setting the groups, that's fine. And then it never goes to that branch. That's a bit weird because I'm pretty sure the conditions are met. Okay, let's see. I cannot see the unit group. That's a bit sad. I'm just going to add the breakpoint right here. Okay, my unit group ID. I still cannot see the unit group ID. That's weird. I cannot see anything. That's not good. Okay. If I look at the groups here, oh, okay, I have a value there. Okay, the group ID is set to -99. Okay, we can see that. And the group 2's group ID is still set to -99 also. That's weird. They should not be -99. Actually, these groups ID are 0 and 1, I think, or it doesn't know. It doesn't know. Anyway, but they should not be -99. So that's a bit weird. I think we're never setting the group ID. So let's go see. I'm just going to stop, go when we are adding the units in the group right here. So I'm checking if the group ID is not -99. I'm finding the group from the mapping, so that's going to create a new group if it doesn't exist. And then I'm going to add the units inside that group, that's fine. And then I'm adding back the group in the mapping, which is good, but I'm never setting the group ID. Oh, that's not good. Okay, so in between right here, I'm going to set a member in Overworld Units group right here, just to set the group ID. So every time we are going to add a unit in the group, it's going to set its group ID just to make sure that it's always clean. And then we can add it back in the mapping and that should work. Okay, let's go see how it looks in the game now. I'm just going to disable the grid again to make sure that it works. Then I'm going to add a few units in the overworld. There we go. I have a Fuyu warrior and then I'm going to fight against priest this time. Mark the priest as an encounter, why not? And then I can move my warrior. Oh, I have a breakpoint. I'm just going to remove the breakpoint. There we go. Resume. And now move the warrior and attack the priest. Oh yeah, we are in combat now. That's good. Now I can end my turn. I can move around, I can cast a few spells probably. Here we go, and my turn again. The other one can move, can attack. Here we go. That works like a normal combat. That's pretty nice. The priests are going to do something maybe. Yeah, they are attacking me. That's pretty good. Now if I end my combat though, I never implemented the logic, so yeah, nothing's happening. I'm not destroying the grid, I'm not putting the units back on the grid, I'm not healing them, I'm not doing anything. So let's go do that because that's not nice. But before going back in the group manager, I'm just gonna go in my BP unit first, and right here I'm going to create myself one new function to reset the health point of my units, because right now we're resetting the movement point and the action point, but we're never resetting the health point. Actually, we don't have a function for it. We just have a little bit of code right here that is doing it in the function, the debug respawn after a few seconds. Right here we are resetting the health point, but instead of just having it right here, I'm just going to move it inside a new function, so it's a little bit cleaner. So I'm just going to right click collapse to function, which I'm going to name reset HP, and we now have a function that resets the health point of our units. Let's go inside that function to modify it a little bit. And what I'm going to modify is actually just related to the animation, because we don't always want to respawn the unit when we are resetting its HP. If the unit is not dead, well, we don't need to respawn it. So I'm just going to shuffle things around a little bit. I'm going to move that out of the way right here. And at the beginning of the function, I'm just going to check if my unit is alive. So if my unit is alive, I don't need to respawn it. So in that case, when it's false, if the unit is dead, I'm going to respawn the unit and then reset the health point just like that. But if the unit is alive, I'm just going to also make sure that I'm putting it back to to idle just to make sure that it works. So idle right here, and then I'm going to set its current HP back to the maximum. Here we go. The only reason why I'm resetting the animation state back to idle right here when we are resetting the alt point is just to make sure that the unit is always back in idle when we are resetting its alt point. So if it was casting a spell or walking around or things like that, we're just going to set it back to idle, and then we can reset the alt point as before. Perfect. So now we have a function that resets the unit's alt point. Now we can go use that function to reset the unit once the combat is ended, and that's gonna be inside the Overworld Unit Group Manager. And to be able to react to when the combat is ending, we have to hook ourselves to that callback, which is going to be inside the set combat system. So when we are setting the combat system, I'm just going to hook myself to the on-combat ended callback right here. I'm going to create myself a new matching function right here, on combat ended, and I assigned it to the create event right here, and that's inside this function that we're gonna react and reposition the units in the overworld when the combat is ending. So let's do that, but the first step is to make sure that the object that started the combat, so the object that started the combat is equal to self, which is the Overworld Unit Group Manager, because we don't want that if any other object in the game started the combat, so let's say the debug menu or something else, we don't want the Overworld Unit Group Manager to take control of the end of the combat and reposition units in the overworld. That will probably not make sense in most situations, so that's why we have to make sure that the object that started the combat is the Overworld Unit Group Manager before starting to do anything. Good. Okay, so now we're sure that the object that started the combat is the Overworld Unit Group Manager. Now, what do we want to do? Well, we want to first remove all the units from the combat, and then maybe we want to respawn some of them or destroy some of them if we don't need them anymore. So let's say if the player killed an enemy group, we don't want to respawn that enemy group. The enemy group is dead. We don't want it anymore. We just kill it. And that's what we're gonna do. So if the right object started the combat right here, I'm just going to loop through all the unit teams that were currently in combat. So loop through all the unit teams. I have my team index right here that I promoted into a new local variable just so it's a little bit cleaner. So I'm looping through all my teams. Then for all my teams, I want to look through all the units and decide if I want to destroy the unit or kill the unit. So let's do that. I'm going to loop through all the units that are in the team right here. I have to promote it into a new local variable that I have right here because we're going to modify the units team during the loop right here. So right here, we are fetching directly the unit array from the team index inside the combat system, and that variable is going to update itself every time. And if we connect that variable directly to the for each loop like so, it's going to break everything because the for each loop is going to modify that variable, and then it's going to go to the next loop, which is going to modify that variable and then go to the next loop, and that's not good. We don't want to do that ever. We don't want to modify the array while the for each loop is running. That's why right here I'm going to promote that into a new copy of that variable right here. Otherwise you will have really weird behavior, so don't do that. Let's just copy the variable before doing the for each loop. So here I'm taking my array, I'm setting it into a new local variable to copy it, and then I can modify the original array no problem because I have a copy and I'm using that copy to iterate through during my for each loop. Perfect. So now I'm looping through all the units in my team, and that's what I was saying. We have to remove the unit from the combat, which is going to remove them from the unit array, and that's what will break everything if we were to use the original array instead of a copy while doing the for each loop. So we are removing the units from the combat because the combat is ended. We have to remove all the units one by one. The combat is over. We don't need them to be in combat anymore. And then we have to decide, okay, what do we want to do with those units? So we either want to reset the health point of that unit, so respawn it, because let's say it was the player units and we want to respawn the player units because it's still a prototype. We're not in the final game, so maybe we always want to respawn the player units. So that's what I'm gonna do in my case. So that's why right here I'm resetting the health point of my unit. Otherwise I'm just going to destroy it. So if I don't need the unit anymore because let's say the unit was dead in combat and I don't want to respawn that unit, I'm just going to destroy it because the combat is over. We don't need that unit anymore. We don't want to respawn it in the overworld. We don't need it. It's dead. So let's just kill it completely. And now for the conditions, well, we have a few conditions. So I'm just going to make a big OR right here with 3 conditions, and those conditions can change depending of your game. In my case, since it's a little bit of a prototype, I'm going to have some specific conditions, but in your case, maybe you want to always kill the units if they are dead in combat, even if they are controlled by a player, or even if the player lost the combat, or things like that. So you can modify those conditions depending what you want, but in my case, I want that if the team index of the unit is the same as the player index, the player team, we want to always respawn that unit. So all the units that are controlled by the player are going to be respawned. And here the reason why I'm using 0, and I'm sure that the player team index is always going to be 0, it's because the Overworld Unit Group Manager started the combat, and in our case, in the trigger encounter, we decided that the player team was the team 0. Okay, good. Now we're respawning the unit that are controlled by the player. That's good. The next step I would like to do is to also respawn the unit that are inside the winning team in the combat. So let's say if the player lost the combat but managed to kill a few units in the opposing team before losing the combat, then I would like to respawn all the units that were dead in the opposing team. So that's why I'm going to reset all the health point of the opposing team in the case that the player lost the combat. And finally, the last thing I would like to do is to reset everything in the case that it was a draw. Nobody won the combat, so the player canceled the combat or things like that. In that case, I'm just going to reset the health point of everything also. So all the units are going to be reset if they are in the player team, if they are in the winning team, or if it was a draw. And otherwise, so let's say the player won the combat, so that's going to be the player team, that's going to be the player team, and that's not going to be a draw. We are going to destroy the enemy units. That's another way to see it. Okay, good. So now we are removing all the units from the combat and deciding if we want to either respawn them or destroy them. That's good. So now that part is done. We're done with the combat part. Now the next step will be to reposition the units in the overworld, because when the units die in combat, we are moving them at the other side of the world. Same thing when we triggered the combat at the beginning. All the units that were not in the combat at all, we were moving them at the other side of the world. And that's why we have a unit position when combat started right here to remember where the units were before starting the combat. So now we're going to use that variable to reposition the units on the world, and we're going to do that after looping through all the teams. So we are done looping through all the teams that were currently in combat, and now what we're going to do is loop through all the units that were in the overworld before starting the combat. So let's do that. I'm going to loop through all of them, and as usual I have a local variable for my unit just because it's a little bit cleaner. And now what we're going to do is to check if that unit is still valid. So if the previous step, the step that we're checking if we want to destroy or respawn the unit right here, if we destroyed the unit right here because we didn't need them, well, we don't want to reposition them in the overworld anymore. So here I'm just checking, okay, is my unit still valid? Was it destroyed by the previous step? And if it is still valid, well, then I can reposition it in the overworld. So it's super simple, just have to take the unit and position it back in the overworld at the right location. But actually that's not it, because we disabled all the units we didn't need during the combat, so they are in a disabled state. And same thing for all the units that were in the combat, they are in combat state. Now we have to make sure to put them back in an overworld state, and that's what I'm gonna do right here. So enable the unit in an overworld context. Here we go, now the unit is in the overworld and ready to be controlled by the player or move around the same way they were moving before. Perfect, so that's done. Now my loop is done. I don't need that variable anymore because we moved all the unit to the right location, so we can just clear the variable so it's a little bit more clean. We don't need it anymore, just clear it. So good, now the combat is stopped, the units are placed back in the overworld, they are re-enabled in an overworld context, so that's pretty good. But now nothing is going to move on the grid. Actually, the player is going to be able to select a unit, control it, and move it around the same way it was doing before, but the encounters are not going to move on the grid randomly the same way they were doing before, because we stopped their movement when the combat started. So now if we want them to start moving again, well, we have to start their movement again. So that's what I'm gonna do right here. After clearing my variable, I'm just going to loop through all the units group that are in the overworld right here. I'm going to loop through all of them. I'm going to check, okay, is that group an encounter? And if so, I'm going to ask it to move in the overworld. So I'm taking the first unit in the overworld group, I'm telling it to move to a random location, and once that unit started walking in the overworld, all the other units in the overworld in the group are going to follow that unit the same way it was doing before. That's the same exact logic, I'm just re-putting them right here. And now for the final step of this function, it's actually super simple, and it is just to destroy the grid, because, well, we don't need it anymore. The combat is over, we don't need a grid, destroy the grid, that's it, we're done, the combat is over. So yeah, if I zoom out a little bit, so the steps are to make sure that it's the right object that started the combat. Then we are going to remove the unit from the combat right here. I'm going to decide if I want to either respawn the unit or destroy it depending on my conditions, conditions that you can modify on your side if you want to. Then for all the units in the overworld, I'm going to place them back in the overworld the same way they were before the combat started. After that, I'm going to ask all my encounter groups to start moving in the overworld randomly the same way they were doing before. And finally, we're destroying the grid because we're done with it. And that's it. So let's compile that, and now we can see in the game how it looks. So let's add a few units in the overworld. So let's say I'm going to have, let's say, 2 warriors in my team. I'm going to have a group of slimes right here. I'm going to have a group of chicken, doesn't really matter, and a little group of bats. These 3 groups are going to be encounters. Here you go. And now if I try to attack one of my groups, so let's say the slime right here, hey, come here, come here, come here, I want to attack you. It spawns the grid, and now I can control my units in the combat. The same one we had in the previous step. So now I can attack the unit, and my turn, move around, I cannot attack. Okay, here we go. I'm going to end my turn again. Now my warriors are going to be attacked, blah, blah, blah. I want to make sure that the health point reset properly at the end. So I'm going to take a few hits to make sure that it works. My warrior are getting attacked. Here we go. Here we go. Ali, Ali, Ali. Okay. So my warrior is attacked. Okay, that's good. Now I can attack back the slime. Here we go. It works. I can move around, attack. Okay, that seemed to work. Everything works as expected. Perfect. And my turn. Okay, for that warrior, I'm just going to attack. Oh, I cannot attack. Okay, that's... okay, my warrior cannot attack, but I'm pretty sure like it has enough action points, so that's weird. Okay, I'm just going to end my turn. Maybe it's just a small bug. I'm going to also increase the speed a little bit to see if it works again. Here we go. My warrior are moving. Okay. Cannot attack again. And my turn cannot attack. Okay. Okay, that's not normal. Let's see. I'm just going to debug it a little bit. Ooh, my warriors are going to die. That's not good. Going to eject real quick. Go in, let's say, BP unit, because that's where we have the function can cast spell right here. This is the function that decides if the unit is able to cast the spell or not. So I'm just going to add myself a bunch of breakpoint right here in the returns. Okay, good. So I did that with the F9 key, but if you don't know the shortcut, you can just right click and toggle a breakpoint just like that. Here we go. So now I have to select which unit I want to debug in my list, and in my case I'm just going to eject and let's say choose this one right here, BP unit 1. So right here I'm going to go back in the unit and select the BP unit 1. Here you go. Now I should be able to go to the next unit, so end turn. So I'm just going to reprocess again, go to the next unit, here we go, and we can see that I'm returning false right here because I cannot cast the spell. Okay, that's weird. So my spell is available, that's good, and this is the problem. I don't have enough stats. Apparently that doesn't make sense, but sure. If my health point is greater than the health point cost, that's good. Movement point greater or equal MP cost, then action point cost. That's fine, that makes sense. Why doesn't that work actually? Just going to yeah, the function doesn't display me the values. Oh, that's good. I hate when it does that. Okay, let's just resume. Okay, it comes back again. I cannot cast the spell. Okay, and my warrior. Okay, so my stats are 6 action point and -5 movement point, and I know that my spell costs 3 action point, and my other spell is 3 action point also. So my unit should have enough action point to cast the spell. I'm gonna go back in the BP unit right here and look at the logic a little bit. And okay, so if my movement point are greater or equal to the MP cost, which is actually not true, because my movement point are under 0 and my spell costs 0 movement point. Okay, that's the issue. Okay, okay, that was not planned, but okay, let's fix that. I'm just going to remove all my breakpoint first. So F9 of all those, F9, 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 and F9, and I'm just going to stop the game. And now I'm going to add a few more checks right here to check if the spell cost is equal to 0, because if it's equal to 0, I don't have to have more points than 0 because it's 0. So I'm just going to disconnect those links right here. Here we go. And now I want to check if the spell, let's say, costs 0 health point. So if the spell costs 0 health point, that means that I can cast the spell. Actually, I don't need to check my current health point because the spell costs 0. So I'm just going to add a little OR right here. So if I have more health point than the required health point, or if the health point required is 0, it means that I can cast the spell. So that's it. That should fix the issue for the health point. Now we're going to do the same thing for the movement point. So if the spell cost movement point is equal to 0, or if I have more movement point than what I need, then I can cast my spell. And finally, same thing, if the action point cost of the spell is equal to 0, or if I have more action point than what I need, then I can cast the spell, and that should fix the issue. So let's go back in the game and test all that. So I'm just going to add myself a bunch of warrior again, a few slimes, here we go. Actually, that's a lot of slimes, but whatever. A few chickens here because I want to test everything, make sure everything works also. Make them encounter, encounter, and encounter. Now I can select my warrior and attack my slime the same way I did before. Now I can move my warrior around, attack the slime. I cannot because they are far, but whatever. The idea is there. Okay, that one I can attack it. That's good. And my turn. And now the slimes are going to attack my warrior. Tip, tip, doo, doo, doo. Maybe they are going to lose enough movement point for us to test if the fix worked actually. So I'm just going to wait a little bit. Actually, I'm just going to speed up everything. Here we go. Two, because there's a lot of slimes. Okay, now I have 0 movement point and I can still cast my spell. So that's good. Actually, I can cast the spell, but I cannot attack anything because the slime is far. So whatever. That one is at -2 movement point. And now I'm able to cast my spell. Yes, that works. Yes. So the fix worked. Good. I'm just going to end my turn and wait a little bit because I want to see if my respawn mechanic works. So I'm just going to attack the slimes a little bit, make sure everybody loses health point a little bit. That slime, if I was able to kill the slime, that would be nice. So I'm just gonna wait. Is it my turn again? Is it my turn again? It takes so much time. Okay, good. Now I'm just going to end my turn, kill that slime. That's good. So one slime is dead. Now I can just end my turn again. I'm probably going to lose a combat, so I'm just going to wait for that to happen. Let's say I'm going to end my turn and lose the combat right here. Here we go. So now I'm just going to reset the game speed. Here we go. Now I lost the combat. My warriors are dead. I killed one slime. So let's just end the combat and see if it's going to reset everything. Okay, the warriors are respawned. The slime, I don't know if I respawned every slime because there was a lot of slimes, but at least my warrior seems to be respawned and all the groups in the overworld are moving by themselves. So that works too. I'm able to move my warrior also, so that's pretty good. I'm going to attack my slimes to see if all the slimes are there. So it seems to be there and they are all full HP. Same thing as my warrior. My warrior are full HP also, and that's pretty good. Good. So at least I guess the mechanic works now, so I can just end the combat. I hit one of the slimes, ending my combat, and then if I move my warrior again and attack one of the slimes, all the slimes seems to be full HP. That's pretty good. Okay, good. So now the end of combat works. We are resetting everything and we are now able to trigger multiple combat over and over and over until the end of time. That's pretty good. There's still one last little bug to fix though. Right now, if I hover one of my units on the grid or in the unit bar on the right here, we can see that it overs the whole group, and that's not what we want. We just want to over one of the units, and that's happening because in the Overworld Unit Group Manager, we decided that we wanted to over all the units in the same group when we are overing one of the units, but actually we don't want to do that while in combat. So let's just stop and go fix that. That's going to be in the Overworld Unit Group Manager. That's going to be inside the function, let's say, group behavior on unit over the change right here, and this is where we are overing all the other units that are in the group of the over the unit, but we don't want to do that while we are in combat. So at the beginning, I'm just going to move that out of the way and check if I'm currently in combat. So if I'm overing a unit, if I'm not in combat, so if it's false right here, I'm going to also over all the other units. Otherwise, I'm not going to do that because, well, that's not what we want. We want to only over one unit at a time in the combat. So now that's good. Let's go see how it looks in the game. I'm just going to add a few warriors and then let's say a few chickens. Why not? That one's going to be an encounter. Then I can move my warriors to attack the chicken. Come here, little chicken. Here we go. I have my chicken, and now if I over one of the chicken, it only overs one of the chicken. Same thing for my warrior. That's good. So that's another bug that is fixed. Yay! But actually, we're not done. There's still one other bug to fix before ending today's video. So I'm just going to re-add a few units on the grid to show you. So I'm going to add a few chicken and a few warriors in my grid right here. I'm just going to remove the grid because I don't want my grid to be generated by default. Here we go, just to see that it works. And I'm going to, let's say, switch the environment. Actually, before doing that, I'm just going to prove you that we can start the encounter. So start the encounter against the chicken. Here we go, it works. I can end my combat and go back on the overworld. That's good. Now in my grid, I'm just going to change my environment to, let's say, a triangle. Now I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to select my warriors and attack the chicken. Here we go. And now it starts the combat on a square grid. Okay, and the grid is not made to work on that level. That's not good. We have to find a way to tell the Overworld Unit Group Manager to which grid type to spawn when we are starting the combat. And in my case, well, I don't really have a way to do that right now. And the simplest way for me, actually, is to just check which level is currently loaded. So I have my level hexagon, square, and triangle. I'm just going to check, okay, which one is currently loaded. And in this case, it's the triangle. So I'm just going to spawn the triangle grid instead of the square grid like that. So yeah, it's probably not the best way in all the cases, but in this case, since it's still a prototype and it's a simple project, that's probably the simplest way, and that's what we're gonna do. So let's just stop. That's going to be inside the Overworld, the Unit Group Manager, inside the function that triggers the encounter. So at the beginning of the combat, when we are spawning the grid, using the grid data right here, we are using the grid shape square because it's the default grid shape in my case. So to decide which grid shape I'm going to use, I'm just going to create myself one new function for it. So let's just drag this out of the way, create a reroute node that I can then collapse into a new function. So collapse to function, I'm going to name it guess a grid shape from loaded levels. So I'm really going to guess which grid shape I want to use based on the level list. I'm going to make the function pure so we can connect it like so. And finally, we can go inside the function to do the logic that detects which level is loaded and decide which grid type to spawn. And the way I'm going to do that, well, it's simple. Since my level names are all L underscore the enum value, so L underscore hexagon, L underscore square, or triangle, we can simply recompose the name of the level. That's probably not the cleanest way to do it, but it's the simplest way to do it. So I'm just going to loop through all my possible grid shapes. So for each loop, E grid shape right here, and I'm going to recompose the name of my level. So L underscore the grid shape, and that should give me the name of the level. Now I can just check if that level is loaded. First, I'm just going to get the streaming level right here. I have my level. I'm going to check if the level is valid, because if it's not valid, well, it's never going to be loaded. So I don't care about that one. If the level is valid, then I'm just going to check, okay, is it visible? Is the level visible in the game? And if so, I'm going to use that grid shape as grid shape to spawn my grid, because, well, it matches the grid shape of the level name. That's as simple as that. So I'm taking my enum value, I'm returning it right here. As soon as we find one streaming level that is visible and that matches one of my enums, I can stop iterating and simply return the grid shape right here. And finally, in my case, in the case that I didn't find any valid grid shape in my levels, I'm just going to return square, because that's my default grid shape in the case that there's a problem. If you prefer having an hexagon or a triangle shape instead, you can do that. In my case, I'm just selecting the square. Anyway, that's it. I think that should fix all of our issues. Here we go, so now I can control my units in the overworld and I can attack any of the groups as before. We tested that a bunch of times already, so yeah, I am in combat, I can move around, cast spells and things like that. That's good. I'm just going to end my combat and try to do it in another world. So just going to change my grid shape to an hexagon, let's say. Okay, a few units fell out of the world, but then they were respawned on top, so that's pretty good. I'm going to select my group and let's say attack this encounter right here in the bottom right corner this time. Here we go. Now it's spawned an hexagon grid. I can somewhat move around because the grid tile are a little bit weird, but at least I can move around and cast some spell, and that's pretty good. Now I'm just going to cast spell, attack everything because I can, and then I'm just going to end my combat. The units are repositioned in the overworld. Now I'm just going to switch it to the triangle grid. Here we go. Select my units in the overworld and trigger another encounter. This time, let's say the bats group right here. So let's trigger that one. It's going to spawn a triangle grid, and now I can move around and attack the bats in the triangle grid shape combat. And that's pretty weird. I don't know my ranges in that grid shape because, well, that doesn't really make sense. Oops, I missed. Anyway, so yeah, now I can trigger all the combats in all the different grid shapes, and it seems to work perfectly fine. So that's pretty good. And I think that's going to be it for today's video, because now you can start any type of combats you want and then stop the combat, start another combat, and do it over and over and over until the end of time. And that's pretty nice. So that's gonna be it for today, and I'm gonna see you in the next one. Bye bye.